fires. Sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Well, and those are both true. And that's part of that opponent processing. You need the hierarchy. Social animals organize themselves hierarchically. Hierarchies are way older than capitalism, way older than the West. They're older than trees. They're unbelievably ancient. There's no getting rid of the hierarchy. But hierarchies tend towards corruption and dispossession.
And those are tied, by the way, with the lobster.
Yes, exactly. Yes, someone gave me this. Yeah, exactly. 350 million years of hierarchies. Now, that doesn't mean we should organize our societies on the lines of the lobsters. That's not the point. The point is that you can't attribute the existence of hierarchy to the West or to capitalism. So that's a foolish critique. That's the basic Marxist critique, is at least part of it. Okay, so the left wing says, wait a second now, the hierarchies tend towards corruption, and they dispossess people and they need to be taken care of. It's like, yes. How much should we take care of them versus how much should we sustain the hierarchy? And the answer is, we don't know, and it changes. So that's why you need political dialogue. Okay, so what's the fundamental necessity for political dialogue? Freedom of speech. So freedom of speech is the mechanism that keeps the opponent process balanced. And so you don't mess with freedom of speech, which is why I opposed the legislation that I opposed in Canada, which started all this political...
The transgender legislation. Just for 2 seconds on this. Yeah. So there was a law that said you must refer to transgender people the way they want you to, right? Picking the pronoun they use.
Yes, that was part of the legislation, background part of the legislation.
They use in private settings in your practice or in your classrooms?
My proclivity when people ask me to address them in a certain way is that if I believe that they're being straightforward in their communication, then I tend to accede to the demand, like a reasonable person does. So that wasn't the issue. The issue was the compulsion of speech and also the government's insistence that it was all right to build a social constructionist view of gender into the law, which is now the case it's the case in New York. It's also the case in Canada. And that's not appropriate because gender is not socially constructed in its entirety. It has a biological basis. So you don't build that into the law. So, but anyways, that it was the compelled speech issue that really got me. It's like, no, you don't have sovereign control over my speech. Never in the history of English common law has the that compelled voluntary speech. There has been restrictions on hate speech. There's more of those in Canada than there are in the US. And I don't agree with them either. I think that's a mistake, but that's a separate issue. Compulsion in speech, your Supreme Court deemed that invalid in 1942. No compulsion of speech in the private sphere, no matter what the reason. And I think that's the correct principle.
And what's the issue with hate speech?
Well, hate speech exists, clearly. The question is, it's the fundamental issue. Who defines hate? And that's like the Achilles tendon of the Achilles heel of the law. It's like the answer is those people who you least want to define it. So what you want is you want to have people say their hateful things out in the open where you can keep an eye on them and where they can invalidate their own viewpoint, which is generally what happens.
Invalidate their viewpoint?
Yes.
So they say something hateful, racist, for example. The society says, you guys, you're missing the boat. You're completely off target with this.
Right.
You're reprimanded, spanked, you get back in line.
Right, exactly that.
That's how it's supposed to work.
Yeah, well, that's a good way of putting it, because what it also means is that the people who espouse those opinions, for whatever reason, get appropriately subjected to social correction. That's good. You want them to be subjected to social correction.
So what happens if the government passes a law saying you can't say those words? Then where do they go?
Underground. And psychologically and socially. And that's not good, because then you don't know what's going on. Like this thing that happened with Alex Jones is a good example of that. It's like, leave Alex Jones alone. Why? Because you want to see what he's up to. You want to know.
Not because you like him, but you want to see what he's up to.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to see what people are up to. You know, because sometimes extremists are correct. Almost never. they're almost always dangerous beyond belief, but like one time in 1,000, things have changed so radically that someone who appears extreme is correct. Well, you got to be able to know when that's the case. You got to keep an eye on it. You know, and it's not clear to me at all that most of the followers of Alex Jones necessarily agree with him. Maybe they're mildly entertained by his antics, whatever it might be, but it was a mistake to go after him. So you got to keep an eye on him. Plus, you shouldn't persecute people who are paranoid.
That was Kissinger's big statement to Nixon, about Nixon. Even paranoid people have enemies.
Right.
Now you can confirm their bias.
Right, that's exactly right. Yes, that's not a good idea.
Why is every person watching us right now, and there are quite a few, suffering from anxiety, depression, addiction, all three together even? How's it possible we're not all there in that quandary?
Oh, well, first of all, many people are at different periods in their life. Right, it's a rare person who doesn't have a severe bout of anxiety at some point in their life, often because things collapse around them, you know, like they encounter some real catastrophe. Even with depression, if you look at the epidemiological studies, most people who eventually suffer depression had their first episode precipitated by something truly awful. So, you know, we move in and out of states of terrible negative emotion throughout our life.
Why don't we stay there? What makes us better? Almost subconsciously, we have a resilience.
Yeah, well, some of it's the grace of God and blind luck. You know, some people are just healthier than other people, and that makes a big difference. So, you know, you don't want to be too morally self-righteous about the absence of anxiety in your life. It could easily be due to your characterological strengths and your willingness to confront things voluntarily and all that, but health plays a big role. Health and good fortune. You know, I mean, you meet people now and then who are in their 40s and they've never suffered a serious loss from death, for example.
Do you think part of the reason that people find their path is because they know the story they're in?
Oh, definitely.
And some folks, they don't know what story they're in, or they're in someone else's story as a bit player, as you've articulated.
Yeah, well, we've produced some things, some exercises online to help people get their story straight. There's one exercise called future authoring.
Speak about that. I did that, actually.
Yeah, well, you know, the idea was that it's based on exactly the questions you asked, which is, well, what's the story of your life? Is it a comedy or a tragedy? Comedy is something with a happy ending, fundamentally, and a tragedy is, well, it starts bad and gets worse. You know, and is it a tragedy that someone else is imposing on you, or some bit of you that you don't understand? What's the story of your life? Part of that is, well, what do you want? What are you aiming at? That's the reverse of sin, right? You're aiming at something. Well, the Future Authoring Program helps you determine what it is. What do you hope for? So the exercise basically assumes that you treat yourself as if you're someone that you're taking care of. So that's the presupposition. You're valuable, despite your flaws. It would be okay for you, and maybe all right for the universe as a whole, if your life wasn't any more wretched than it has to be. So we could set it up for that. Okay, so now, if you were looking 3 to 5 years down into the future, and you could have what you needed within the bounds of reason, what would it be? What do you want? What do you want from your family? What do you want from your friends? How are you going to educate yourself? What are you going to do for your career? How are you going to take care of your mental and physical health? How are you going to resist temptation? What are you going to do with your time outside of work that's productive and meaningful? You get to have it. It's like knock and the door will open. Okay, you got to knock first. Well, and then you got to pick the door. And like, oh, I really like this because it is, you cannot catch something you're not pursuing. So now, if you're pursuing it, that doesn't mean you'll catch it. But generally, you'll catch something interesting along the way. You know, that's the thing that's so cool about this. Let's say you set out a vision, you start pursuing it, you don't get what you were after. But you learn a lot as you move towards that destination. And as you learn, your vision is going to change, and you may end up with something that's better than what you were aiming at to begin with. But that won't happen unless you initiate the journey. That's partly something I learned from the Abrahamic stories, with the story of Abraham in particular, because God calls Abraham to an adventure when he's like 85. It's like, get out of your father's tent, for God's sake. Get out there in the world, right? And really, that's how the story is set up. Leave your family and your tent. It's time to get out in the world. Well, what does he confront? Famine is the first thing, tyranny, and the potential loss of his wife. It's like Abraham must have been going, it's like the tent's looking pretty good. But it's this call to adventure. Okay, so you put together a vision, that's your call to adventure. Get out there in the world and contend with it. Well, you might not get what you want, but you might find what you need. But it won't happen without the pursuit. And that's part of faith, right? Faith is, I'm going out in the world to seek my fortune. And if I do that properly, then the fates will cooperate with me.
How do the archetypal stories that we, in our subconscious have, archetypal questions are the ones that everyone really is trying to ask,
Yeah.
even if we can't put words